Good evening and welcome to everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes with our panel discussion, but on behalf of our team, thank you all for joining us for this panel discussion. We are here tonight to learn techniques so that we can have successful and productive conversations with our children and youth concerning the spread of hate rhetoric and crimes. The Social Justice Resource Center is committed to exposing this type of hate in our communities, especially when it manifests itself in the systems that have historically impacted people of color. And those systems are education, policing, the courts, and prisons. We are joined here today by two panelists, Dr. Michelle Mitchell and Shandia Booker, who will help us learn the best ways to have these difficult conversations with our children. Dr. Michelle Mitchell completed her doctorate of philosophy, PhD, at the University of Central Florida in August of 2018. Prior to the completion of her terminal degree, she received a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Duquesne University. She is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Pennsylvania and an MBCC board certified counselor. She is presently an assistant professor at Wake Forest University, where she assists in the development of undergraduate and graduate students through counseling curricula and advising, maintains an active research agenda, and participates in professional service. Dr. Mitchell remains active in service through her roles as a member on several American Counseling Association Division standing committees, including the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development's Vice President of African American Concerns, the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. Dr. Mitchell's commitment to multiculturalism in counseling has been previously recognized through the 2020 AMCD Young Emerging Leader Award and as a 2019 ACA Portland Lee Excellence Scholarship Award. Ms. Shandia Booker, master's degree in education, is a graduate of Duquesne University and a certified school counselor in the state of Pennsylvania. Having grown up in the inner city of Pittsburgh, PA, Shandia is passionate about helping the next generation of queens succeed and reach their goals. She understands the importance and need for girls to know and embrace their value amidst their circumstances. Shandia has clinical experience in working with underprivileged and marginalized populations. In 2015, with a goal to empower preteen girls as they transition from elementary to middle school, Shandia developed a program titled Love Yourself that has impacted hundreds of girls in the city of Pittsburgh. Shandia is the owner of Creative Solutions Consulting Services. As a result of advocating for homeless students in Pittsburgh Public Schools, Shandia received the Region 4 2017 Regional Homeless Advocate of the Year Award by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. On July 10th, 2018, Shandia's first book, Dear Brooklyn, Love Yourself, was released and it debuted as an Amazon #1 new release. In the same year, the Author Zone awarded Shandia with a TAZ Book Award in the self-help category. Shandia has been an invited speaker for counselors in training at various institutions, including Duquesne University, Wake Forest, and the University of Pittsburgh. Additionally, Shandia has spoken at conferences and events such as the State of Black Learning, Black Female Leadership Development Institute, and Sisters Saving Ourselves Now. Shandia was selected as a New Pittsburgh Courier 2019 Fab 40 Award recipient. During the 2020 and 2021 school year, Shandia was recognized as a College Board Award recipient. So you can see, everyone, that we are going to have a great panel discussion with these two remarkable educators. And our moderator tonight is Reverend Tim Smith from Center of Life, the CEO of Center of Life, a community empowerment organization and our sponsoring agency. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Danielle to please give us instructions on how to ask questions during the discussion.
Good evening, everyone. So tonight you will be able to ask any questions that you have through the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. The chat is disabled, so we're asking everybody to ask their questions through the Q&A. And if we run out of time and there are questions that go unanswered, Dr. Mitchell and Ms. Booker have agreed to take those questions, and they will, I'll send them an email with those questions and they'll reply to me and I will disperse those answers out to you all. And just so everybody knows, we are recording this meeting. Everybody will see the recording of the meeting afterwards. None of your faces or names are visible on the recording. So yeah, we're excited to get started. And Tim, if you would take it away, that would be great.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Donna. Thank you, Andy, as well. And just another welcome to Dr. Michelle Mitchell and Shandia Booker. We are so pleased to have you both. This is a very, very significant subject matter that we're going to be addressing here tonight. But I just want to take just a little liberty here and say that we are, without a doubt, in a moment in time at this very moment. Where we know that the verdict just came in on Officer, or what used to be Officer Derek Chauvin, now just prisoner Derek Chauvin, and guilty on all 3 counts. And so, this is also going to be a part of a subject matter that children eventually will talk about, because this particular situation is going to go down in history as something that actually a teenager set off. An African American young lady who was still in high school at the time, I believe, when she picked up her phone and she videotaped the murder of George Floyd. And children will talk about this for years to come when we're long gone. And so something special is happening in the streets right now as we are getting ready to have this very vital discussion. So again, I want to thank you both for being here with us and for joining us on this webinar. I'll just start off with this statement, and then I'd like to ask the question. It's going to go to both of you. Over the last few months, we witnessed an attack on our nation's capital, which was an insurrection by white supremacists. We just finished seeing the trial of Derek Chauvin and the sentencing of not sentencing, but the verdict of Derek Chauvin come forth for the murder of George Floyd. And here in Pittsburgh, the vandalization of local Little League fields with racist words and symbols. Our children and youth are exposed to all of these examples of hate and racism. Let's imagine that you're the parent or you're the teacher of an elementary school student or a teenager or young adult, or trying to start a discussion to find out how your children or student is processing this information. Where do you start and how do you start? And any one of you can start.
Dr. Mitchell, you want to start?
Yeah, so if I could share my screen really quickly for you all. We're going to answer the question, but before we answer that question, and thank you for that warm welcome, we wanted to kind of establish a framework for some of the concepts and terms we might be mentioning during our discussion. So give me a quick minute. So I'm hoping that we can all see our screen. When I'm talking to my students, especially when we're talking about culturally based conversations, I like to start out our conversation with setting a clear foundation of what some of these concepts mean, because what I've learned in my training and my teaching is that sometimes we use terms like social justice. Can you not hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, social justice, discrimination, implicit bias. And we kind of know what we're talking about, but we're not quite sure, right? And so Shandy and I thought it would be helpful to kind of establish a framework for what some of these concepts mean before we answer some of the questions. So when we're talking about social justice, we're really talking about fair treatment of all people in society, right? And that's including respect for the rights of minorities, equitable distribution of resources among various members and all members of community. When we're talking about discrimination, we're really talking about unjust and or prejudicial treatment. So when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about a behavior of different categories of people or things, especially when we're talking about race, age, sex, et cetera, et cetera. When we're talking about racial prejudice, prejudice is really more of a cognition, right? So where our thoughts or our thinking is biased against or hostile toward a particular group of people. In this case, we're talking about racial prejudice. And then the last we wanted to kind of cover was implicit bias. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later, I believe. But that is a bias or prejudice, an automatic assumption or response that presents itself, and it's usually not consciously held, consciously recognized. It happens somewhat automatically based upon some of the things that we've learned within society. So I just kind of wanted to start there. So we kind of are all on the same playing field when we're talking about these various concepts. As it relates to your specific question about where to start, and I've obviously had time to think about this, I was thinking about some of my counseling training and how often my counseling training is really helpful, not just in the counseling space, but in my my personal relationships and obviously relationships with children and adolescents as I'm having difficult conversations. And I thought of 4 different, very quick, easy things that you could do as a parent, as a teacher, as someone that's working with children and adolescents when you're engaging in these conversations. The first is self-awareness / self-reflection, right? And so that probably doesn't seem like the more obvious place to start, but the self-awareness, self-reflection is for you. In the counseling field, we talk about how it becomes really important for us to know how we're thinking, maybe some of our biases, maybe some of our opinions or thoughts about a particular subject matter, before we even broach that with a client. And that requires for us to be honest with ourselves about what our true thoughts, opinions, behaviors are about that particular thing. And so that would be my first suggestion for parents in initiating these sorts of sensitive conversations. The second is establishing a supportive tone, right? And so oftentimes as authority figures or parents, we're telling our kids to go do, the dishes, to clean up. And that requires for us to have maybe a little bit more of an authoritative tone. But when we're having these really sensitive conversations and attempting to better understand where our kids' mindset, thoughts are pertaining to the Derek Chauvin verdict or police brutality that they're seeing on social media, it requires for us to have more of a supportive tone so we really get at the heart of the matter of what they're truly thinking and feeling. The third thing is active listening and open questions. And so again, as a parent, oftentimes, as a an auntie, as a teacher, whatever role you have in children's lives, oftentimes we're being a little bit more directive in our interactions with them. However, when we're having these sorts of conversations, even if our child or a student that you're working with says something that that's not exactly right, allowing for them to talk it through and then providing them with additional perspective. So that active listening piece, not to abruptly stop them, and open questions. And so I know this is something that I utilize often with my niece and nephew. Instead of saying, how was school? Inevitably, the response is going to be good. Like every other kid that I know, it's going to be a single word answer. Attempting to use open questions. So who did you sit next to at lunch? Or what is your thought on the verdict? What have your friends been talking about concerning the George Floyd tape, if that's something that they were exposed to, which I know a lot of adolescents and children were, because of social media and how accessible information is, right? And so asking open questions that somewhat force them to truly share their full scope of their thoughts and opinions, as opposed to a closed question, because oftentimes kids and adolescents, your children, are trying to say what they think you want to hear as opposed to their true thought and feeling. And so open questions really help with that. The last is leaning into discomfort. So inevitably in these types of conversations, you're going to feel uncomfortable. Your child may feel uncomfortable. However, I would suggest, instead of avoiding a conversation because it's uncomfortable or you don't have all of the answers, leaning into some of those uncomfortable feelings, maybe even vocalizing them, right? And so normalizing that for whatever child or adolescent you're working with can be really, really helpful to teach them how to express, letting them know that you are legitimately a safe space to talk about some of these concepts that are a little bit more difficult to express with their peers.
Shandia?
Yes, that was great. So Michelle created an acronym for you. That acronym is SEAL, and I'm sure we can share that to the screen. When we're talking about sensitive topics, one of the key things is creating a space that is not just physically safe, but you have to create an emotionally safe space. So one of the things that Dr. Mitchell addressed early on is that self-reflection piece. So if you know you are struggling yourself with your own implicit biases, or you're grappling with the outcome of the trial, whatever side of the fence you are on, you have to address your own stuff prior to helping your child process their feelings. That is key. And it's very important that you create space for truth to exist, because you may or may not hear alarming perspectives from the youth. It may not be, if you may hear things like, I didn't really teach them that. Where did you get that from? Lean into that, because you do want to know where they are picking up their ideas from. Sometimes it's from friends, sometimes it's from other adults that are around, sometimes it's from social media. But you really want to lean into what they are sharing prior to providing any type of consequence. You want your children to be honest about where they are at in terms of their thoughts and feelings on either side of heavy topics such as this. So I would say the self-reflection piece is key, listening, but creating an environment where your children can be honest and transparent and ask you questions and let them know, you know what, I might need some time to process that, or I might need some time to get back to you, or I don't have all of the answers as it pertains to this specific question, but the space has to be safe.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you both even more. And I was thinking about ways of finding those teachable moments in some of these difficult subject matters, as well as just, as you just mentioned, Shandia, basically I call it hobo in the train. You know, where are the kids at? Like, where are the children at? What space are they in, whether it be mentally or emotionally, and what are they actually saying? Because that's a train that we can ride, and we can figure out why they're on that train and basically begin to work to get them to a place where they can actually deal with the subject matter at some point. But I think what you both have brought forth is some vital information. The second question here is, how can a young person make sense of such ideas as right-wing extremism that we're all hearing about these days? And how can someone protect themselves, express themselves safely among peers and in family situations when they know that they are talking to someone who doesn't see things the way they do? And I'll start off this time with Shandia.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So Dr. Mitchell and I, we had a conversation about this question in particular. And I think we both took the same stance. A young person should not make sense of it. It does not make sense. It is not okay. It is a healthy indicator that it does not make sense. And just leaning into the second part of the question, I'm going to go back to the first question. We have to tell young people the truth. And let's be honest in this space. The truth is, when people speak up, when people advocate, sometimes there are attended consequences, sometimes there are unattended consequences, but that does not mean they should not speak up. So we have to paint the clear picture. What I will say is, if you are a parent and your child has a heavy concern about maybe a situation in school, I would, as the parent, lean in with the child to help them advocate and to help them navigate that space. But I think of Colin Kaepernick a lot, right? So during this pandemic, a lot of racial issues got more attention than they typically have in the past. And Colin Kaepernick, some of the work that he stood up for, it did not get positive attention until after the George Floyd incident. Unfortunately, he lost his job. We have to be honest about this. It's courageous, but it is an unfortunate consequence of speaking up. We have to teach our children it's okay to speak up anyway. And for me, I would reconcile that with my faith. For different families, it's different things. It's okay to still want to do the right thing. Dr. Mitchell.
Right. Yeah, I love that that example of Colin Kaepernick. advocacy is inherently disruptive, and that is kind of my first thought when I'm thinking about this question. And so I remember I remember being in 6th grade, and I don't know why, but I was really upset that the lunch people that were serving our lunches were not wearing hairnets. And myself and a few other friends organized a little, we picketed, and my homeroom teacher actually supported it. We made signs, and we went to recess. We were marching in a circle. And I remember after that, I got called to the principal's office, something that was not typical for me personally. And the principal was very gracious. We didn't get in trouble. But to what Shandy is mentioning, right? Advocacy is disruptive, and it often comes at a cost. And I can't tell you that I know that's a very simple example, but I probably would have still done the same thing knowing me. But to what she's saying from a parental perspective, letting our kids know that it often does come at some cost, right? Because that could be something relatively simplistic, like being called to the principal's office and saying, hey, they'll have hairnets, just please don't cause issues tomorrow. But it could be something a little bit the higher stakes, right? So losing job or being physically harmed, and hopefully we don't have to see more violence. Lord knows we don't need any more of that. But to what Shandy is saying, I certainly support and agree that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to press on and do the right thing. I think specifically when I think about familial situations where you're having a child constantly having to stand up to, say, a family member or something along those lines, I certainly think it is noble to say, hey, I'm raising a child that knows how to stand up for their values and morals, and really advocate for people in general, or people that are underprivileged or marginalized. And I think from a parental perspective, from an adult perspective, really having to grapple with and take into consideration the cost of introducing or continuing to put your child in a position where they have to stand up in those ways.
Yes. And just to add to what Dr. Mitchell said, one thing we learned, we're counseling professionals, is systems inherently try to maintain what we call homeostasis. So systems want to sustain themselves. So you want to teach children that most systems that were created, they were created to sustain themselves. So when opposition comes, what does the system do? It pushes back, because the goal of the system is to stay the same. I think you have to teach children and young adults the tenets of advocacy. So when they face opposition, just like in a basketball game, if you're on the offense, the defense is there. When you face opposition, it is important for them to know and understand that's par for the course. That doesn't mean you lose sight of the vision. And sometimes, that doesn't mean you don't press forward. That means you are moving in the right direction, but the system is going to sometimes do what it wants to do, is resist that change, because change can be hard for people. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I didn't
no,
mean
I was just saying, just providing them with a clear picture so they have the tools and they know how to use the tools. And sometimes just providing them with the way to go, like, okay, I see you're advocating in this space. It might be better if you maybe go over here or talk to this person who will help your mission move forward. So just providing young people even with a framework from a young age, because we do want our students and children to learn how to advocate for themselves in healthy ways. They should not have to feel like the burden is on them to fix adult issues. So we want to do this in very healthy ways and age appropriate ways. And that looks different at every level, from elementary to middle to high school.
You know, it's always amazing to me when I've met a lot of children and I've worked with a lot of children in my time. And when I hear a child speak up and about their rights, about what they believe with some conviction, one of the things that I know is I know that they're being taught at home. They're being spoken to. They have the freedom, like you said, they have the freedom to speak, but their parents are helping to guide their thinking around that subject matter. And I was thinking about these four things that we focus on in the Social Justice Resource Center: education, policing or bad policing, the courts and the prison systems. And I thought about how education is supposed to be a right, but a lot of children don't talk about that. You know, when I served on the Commission on Human Relations for many years, and that was one of the things that I was trying to push at the commission level, because I kept saying children and a lot of parents don't realize that their rights are being violated because their children are not being taught. They're receiving substandard education, which is really against the law, and it's against, you know, what we are paying taxes for. And so we wanted to try to get more and more young people speaking up in that regard, because they were going on to graduate from high school, but not being ready for university, not being ready for the post-secondary education, and on and on. And so much of what you are saying is so significant with respect to how we take this approach and how we help to get information from young people so that we can also help to guide that, you know, sort of guide that path for them. Dr. Mitchell, let me start with you on this next question. Are ground rules for discussion always necessary? And what is the best framework? And how does one set rules for this kind of discussion?
Yeah, so I do think that ground rules are really helpful and necessary. Actually, within my class, and I don't have an image, but I usually draw on a board a circle and then another circle inside of that. And in the very middle, I write comfort. And then in the middle circle, I write discomfort. And on the outside, I write safety, right? And so if you can imagine those three kind of circles, I often frame conversations based on race, especially cultural topics. I talk about how just because we're uncomfortable doesn't mean that we're unsafe, because, you know, you're in a safe space is kind of the hot button word, especially on college campuses. And so I first want to frame and set up the conversation to let my students know that, hey, just because you're uncomfortable does not mean that you're unsafe. I'm here as a faculty member and obviously a counselor to make sure that everybody is psychologically safe. No one's going to be harmed in any of the conversations that we're going to have. The second thing is that there's actually a format called the 4 Agreements of Courageous Conversations. It actually was created by Glenn Singleton, who received his bachelor's degree in Pennsylvania at UPenn. If you all have a second to look at his website, it is dynamic. But he basically created this model that has like before, I'm very systematic, 4 bullet points, so very easy for you to remember or recall. But basically the model that he created was to help support these types of conversations about race, racism, ethnicity, privilege, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know that Shandia is very familiar with the 4.
Yes, I can share if you like.
I'm sorry.
I said I'll share them out once you're finished, if you like.
Yeah. So I think it's really helpful for us not to just know what the 4 agreements are, but really have a thorough understanding of what they all mean. So the first one is stay engaged, right? And so basically when he's saying staying engaged, he's really talking about being emotionally connected, being intellectually and socially involved in the conversation that's taking place. Too often when we don't hear something that we like, that we don't agree with, we kind of go somewhere else in our mind. I don't know if anyone else experiences that, but you kind of, mute out what the person's saying, or you hyper focus on what you want to say next. And basically what staying engaged is, hey, be present in the conversation, be present in the moment with whatever conversation you're intending to have as it pertains to race or racism, ethnicity, privilege, whatever we're talking about. Expect discomfort. I feel like that's one thing that me and Shandia has said multiple times. So if you don't take anything away in the last 35 minutes, it is expect to feel uncomfortable. These are conversations that are going to be uncomfortable, and they're inevitable to be uncomfortable. That does not mean that we're going into the conversations attempting to be divisive. It means that because we don't talk about race openly, we don't talk about police brutality openly, traditionally in society, when we do talk about them, it can be a little, a hot button issue for people, right? People have very strong feelings. And so going into it knowing that you're not going to be warm and fuzzy and butterflies all of the time is something that you have to, understand and have an understanding of with you and your child.
Absolutely. Shandia?
Yes, I'll just go on with the other two agreements. The next one is speak your truth. So you do want to share your perspectives, your life experiences, maybe how your thought process is where it is in the present. It is important because from a place of truth, you can really start to ignite change. It requires not only being honest with the other individual that you're engaging in the conversation with, but really being honest with yourself. And expect and accept a lack of closure. So you may not get closure during that particular conversation, and that's okay. Sometimes more research needs to be done. Sometimes you need to process things. That is a natural part of, just trying to figure these things out. And I will say, that often falls under the 4 agreements of courageous conversations. And I'll say this, I do think it's important. We're in the cancel culture. It's very, we're living in a time where people, it's like cancel people, but we have to be careful. We have to hold space for growth. And I'll give an example. Dr. Mitchell and I attended the same graduate school program. And during our program, we held a lot of courageous conversations. And we had our cohort, we had a diverse cohort, so to speak. And I'm grateful that I heard people's life experience that was not similar to mine. And I'm grateful that they heard mine, because by the time we graduated, I think that it really helped because now they are counselors in the field. But if they were not honest and they did not question and they did not lean in to learn about someone else's experience, I'm not sure what that would have looked like in servicing people that don't look like them. So it is important to be honest with yourself so that you can grow.
The other thing that I feel like I'm hearing from you all is that these situations, they're almost like moving targets at times. And when young people are interested in something, and we know it's a touchy subject, we know we're going to have a courageous conversation. A lot of times we could be too prepared, or we could try to be too controlling of the situation and lose the organic feel that could come to us, that could benefit us as adults, where we could literally ride, like I said earlier, hobo that train. There's a teachable moment there that I think we can find if we're patient, if we're patient and if we're willing to actually follow and learn from the young person, so that we can then teach the young person, So it can go both ways, it doesn't always go one way or the other. What do you think about that, Dr. Mitchell?
The one thing that I was thinking about as Shandia was talking about speak your truth, and kind of going back to younger people sometimes wanting to say to us what they think we want to hear. I was reminded of a quote, speak your truth even if your voice shakes. It's like, even if you have to tremble to get it out. And I am reminded of some of those really tense, uncomfortable conversations that I've had many times throughout my various levels of education, and knowing that I probably wasn't satisfied in the response in the moment, but really I was investing a seed today for the fruit tomorrow, right? And so I was speaking my truth today to somebody to hopefully appeal to something in them in my own lived experiences. So hopefully they take that, hopefully they water it, somebody else waters it. To what Shandia said, a cohort member waters it, and then we see the fruit of, honestly, advocacy and social justice, and being very fired up about working with Black and Brown students and people in our local communities in the future, right? But in 2010, I don't know that I would have been saying that, right? So I'm reminded about how I felt in some of those courageous conversations I've been an active participant in, and how I didn't feel that great about it, but the fruit of it was beneficial.
That's great. That's great. Here's another question. What does a parent do if they find their son or their daughter is beginning to identify with people who are doing hateful things? And this question is a little, up and down, because, hateful things, doing hateful things. There's some things that could be a matter of interpretation. And then there's some things that have this mixture of, okay, we know that they're associating with people who are doing hateful things, but they're actually standing up for something that might be right. So how do we balance that, within with our children? So let's start with Shandia. Why don't we start with you, Shandia?
Okay. So Dr. Mitchell and I kind of discussed this question as well. And one of the things that really stands out to me when children or young people start to associate themselves with maybe a group of people that you're like, they're not making the best decisions, is I often imagine that they're searching for identity and belonging. So from a parent's perspective, I would wonder if my child is seeking out things that maybe they're not recognizing as something present in a home. So for example, if they're attracted to this group group of friends that do things you do not like, but they feel loved, or they feel affirmed, or they feel valued by that group of friends, I think it needs to start with a conversation with your child. And it might be an uncomfortable conversation, because you might have to be open to hear things you really don't want to hear. It can be as something as simple as, well, when I come home, you're always yelling at me. And when I associate with them, you say they like these hateful things, but they embrace me with love. But if we're talking about serious, if your child is starting to affiliate themselves with hate groups, or you believe that, I would say don't take that lightly. I would say get in contact with someone at either your church or your school. Use your resources at schools. Every school has what's called a student assistance program. And in Pittsburgh public schools, let me say that, but the student assistant program is throughout the state of Pennsylvania, where counselors and social workers and other team members convene and we talk about and discuss interventions and supports that may help your child based on the information that you provide. You want to address that early, and you want to address that quickly. It can be something as simple as, they would benefit from being in a group, or they might need mental health counseling, or they might need more intense therapy. But if it's something that you would consider lower level, it would start with a conversation. And if you have a child that tends to withdraw or tends to shut down, I think a colleague of mine and I were just talking about this, Mrs. Wilson and I, sometimes you have to get a game, And while you're playing that game, begin to converse with your child. They might not realize it's not like, oh, my mom wants to talk to me or my dad wants to talk to me. It's just like, oh, we were playing a game and she started asking me questions and it was kind of cool. So play a game and get the conversation going once again to make room for truth. You want to get to, you want to find out, you want to get to the root of the issue, essentially, why they are, attracted to that hate.
Dr. Mitchell, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think that it's a bit of an expansive question. Just to kind of piggyback off of what Shandia is saying, I think making sure that you're regularly touching base and having these types of conversations with your child is important. And I think that that's kind of the thread through probably all of what we've been talking about. I also think just being, like I said at the very beginning in the very first question, right, when I was talking about self-reflection, how you have to be honest with yourself. I think in these sort of situations, it's important for us to be honest about the behaviors that we're seeing in our kids, right? And so if you're already kind of suspecting something is amiss and you're having a conversation, and let's just say, your child or the adolescent isn't really opening up and really sharing, their thoughts and feelings on why they're connecting to people that are doing hateful things. Are there other risk factors that you're noticing in your child? Are they disruptive in class? Are their grades poor? Have they made threats to anyone? Have they made threats to you? Like, these are some of those risk factor things that we can see and experience and know in our child. And so what I would say, one, recognize your child's school counselor as a resource. They're a viable resource. They are masters at what they do. Shandia's smiling because she knows she has so many kids on her roster, right? And like, she's tasked with being responsible and providing assistance to those kids, right? And so viewing your child's school counselor as a viable resource, if you're like, I don't really know, I'm not sure, I would say err on the side of caution and reach out to your child's school counselor, introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm a little concerned about the friends that my child is making, or I'm concerned about some of the social media sites that they're on. I'm not really sure what those identifiers are based upon this question, but whatever those are, reach out to that person. They might be able to link them with a school psychologist to do a psychological evaluation. That doesn't mean that your child's future is over. It means that you're providing them with viable resources and help on the front end. If it's something bigger, if it's not, as Shandia said, that could be something very simple, like a conversation with a school counselor. It could be something as helpful as a group, because groups for people in general, but definitely our youth and children, can be really helpful in them being able to connect with other children that in their peers that are thinking similar to them, and they're able to learn from each other, right? And so that would be my suggestion, is to make sure that you're reaching out to someone. I know it can be hard to find mental health professionals, but that school counselor is there very intentionally.
Our young people today and even before today were growing up online. And so there's so much that they're being exposed to so early in their lives. It makes it kind of difficult for their parents to try to, protect them. But I guess the next question has to do with, how do we save our children's innocence? And it's an interesting question because of where we are right now in our world, because of technology, because of everything is such an easy access, one click and you're there. And so, this question is going to both of you, and I don't envy you for having to answer this question because it's not easy. Let me just say this before you get to your answer. We run a community learning hub in partnership with the Pittsburgh Public Schools. And as we are trying to teach young people and make sure they get their lesson from their teacher online, the young people have ways of going onto these other websites. And I mean, they have, they just figure it out. And then and it's not so easy for us to figure out how to get them off of that, or how to make sure they are off of it once we think they're off of it. So it's a real navigation piece. But let me let you all address this question. This idea of how do we save our children's innocence? Dr. Mitchell.
Sure. So as I was thinking about this question, and it is a very difficult question, especially for us adults. I mean, I remember maybe 4th, 5th grade, I want to say maybe 3rd grade, I was introduced to technology, but these kids are growing up with technology. They just inherently know all the things, social media way better than us. But what we can do is be attentive to, so let me just first address, I don't know that it is realistic and practical for us to say that we're able to fully put our children in bubbles and save their innocence totally. I don't know that that's fully capable. They go to school, they're interacting with their friends are hearing and seeing and experiencing things. And so I want to dissolve the notion that that might even be a possibility for any of our kids. But my thought is to the best of our ability, right? We could be attentive, obviously, to the messages that are being sent to our children, whether it's through news, whether it's through social media, whether it's through friends, having those regular ongoing conversations. But something that this question made me think of was a study that was done, and there's a plethora of research on it. It's called the ACE study. It's an adverse childhood experiences study that was done by Kaiser Permanente. And really this study highlighted traumatic experiences in childhood and trauma, and how those traumatic experiences and the trauma put children at risk later in life for mental health and health outcomes, for negative mental health and physical health outcomes. And so what we're seeing now in contemporary society, or the last several years, is that literature is identifying racism specifically as an adverse childhood experience, right? Mm-hmm. And so even to the best of our ability, attempting to keep our child in a bubble, for our Black and brown babies, racism is pervasive, right? That in and of itself is an adverse childhood experience. And so as parents, as teachers, we're not going to tackle racism, the system of racism all in one fell swoop. But what we can do, what we know that we can do is implement protective factors, right? It's kind of like, let's get as many vegetables in there as possible. And so some of those protective factors, not an extensive list, but teaching your child healthy relationship skills. So having those conversations, those active listening skills, those open questions, those are helping your child. It's not just the conversation you're having with them, you're modeling the type of conversations they need to have with their peers, right? Connecting your youth with caring adults within your family, within your community activities, right? And so the learning center that you all have, having them go to after school programs, having them go to mentoring programs, join a sport. Those are protective factors. Being connected to organization, faith-based communities. I know that as a child, I was in the church all of the time. I'm not saying you have to do that, but that was what my mom thought was best for me, is going to choir rehearsal and usher board meetings and that sort of thing, right? And so I was thrust into a community that at the time, I'm sure she didn't fully know, I'm sure she knew a little bit, but was in very real ways a protective factor for me as I grew up. And particularly when we're talking about organizations, we're talking about organizations that promote nonviolent attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And so all of those things can be helpful to protect your child as best as possible, not totally saying that they're going to avoid issues in society, but they're being protected enough that as they grow up, they won't experience a lot of those adverse negative health outcomes.
Yeah, this is an interesting question here. It really is interesting, but I want to hear more from Shandia on this one.
Yes, it is a very interesting question. So it is very important to teach young people boundaries, what it means to have them, what it means to respect others' boundaries, and what it means to convey your boundaries. I think it is imperative because some young people don't know what a boundary is, why it's important, and an emotional boundary, why it's important and why. So if they don't know why it's important, they may not know why it would be important to respect another person's boundaries. I think that in and of itself serves as a protective factor. There are many books, adult books geared towards adults on boundaries, but I think that you can take some of that knowledge and really implement it with young people and children. And I mean, from a young age, like teaching them that your yes is your yes and your no is your no, teaching them that time management skills too, and making them aware of how much time they are spending on their video game, on social media, maybe within a group of friends. Sometimes young people just aren't aware, and because their minds and their brain, they're in a stage of development and they're still learning and they are still growing. They don't quite grasp what they are seeing on the internet and just going through that feed all day, the impact that it is having on them. So they are seeing a lot of propaganda and picking up a lot of things on social media. You want to put some boundaries around that time to keep your child safe. I mean, video games and social media, make sure they're moving, make sure that you're teaching them how to take care of themselves. And as Dr. Mitchell mentioned earlier, just healthy relationship skills and how to interact with others. I think it's imperative that you have to monitor the people. I mean, you have to let your child know you are aware of the friends they're interacting with and people that they're interacting with, and just to keep that open door policy, like I'm here if you need me, even if you think it's something that you might feel like you're going to get in trouble for. I'm here if you need me, even if you're the person that made the mistake. You need to keep that open door policy, I would say, with your child.
Yeah, it's a situation where when you're talking about trying to protect children's innocence, and all of the things they're being exposed to, it feels like sometimes we are trying to, we have to figure out, well, what is it that we want to save them from? It's almost like we have to pick and choose, like navigating negativity or whatever, and it becomes a real cycle. But I think it goes back to something you both said earlier in this webinar, and that was just really taking the time to continue to communicate with your children, to make sure, I think that we need to communicate with our children more, like more than they need to be on video games and everything else. We need to be talking to them. We need to be hearing what they're saying. And then we don't have to be so afraid when they come to us and say, you know what, I saw this. And we should actually be happy when they do come to us and say, hey, I saw this, or I heard this. What does that mean? And they might bring it in a way, sometimes children bring it in a way where they're using that schema, they bring it in a way where they don't necessarily want to come forward with it, but they want to come at it in a roundabout way. But you'll know where they're coming from. But these are good thoughts. I really appreciate it. This was probably my favorite question on here, because I thought, man, I thought about being a dad and talking to my girls and also talking to my boys. And it's like, oh man, the difference was like night and day for me. Is code switching a form of discrimination that we teach Black and brown students, or is it a safe way to navigate white spaces? Maybe explain what code switching is for everyone listening who isn't familiar with them. We know that there's a lot of that that goes on now.
We have a slide. Dr. Mitchell, did you want to share this slide?
I can. I know that we're running. I know we're running low on time.
Okay.
But what we can do is share the slide for those that are visual learners later.
Okay, so code switching is the practice of alternating between two or more languages or varieties of language in conversation. It's important that we call out the word language because oftentimes within the African American community, it is not acknowledged as such. So a friend of mine said, you know, code switching is not a form of discrimination. It is a result of it. It is a survival technique. So when I was reflecting on this particular question, I thought we have to do a better job as adults of allowing specifically Black and Brown youth to show up in spaces and be themselves. A lot of the code switching that occurs is because it's a survival technique, so they may not feel safe. So if I have to code switch in this space to keep that job, what am I going to do? They're going to code switch. The good news is what I've seen from this younger generation, they feel, I mean, not everyone, I guess it's a more general statement, but I get the sense that they're a little more comfortable in their skin. And we have to make space for that, allow that, because sometimes, or what you'll observe oftentimes, a youth, if you see a youth assimilating to the prominent culture, it's like, okay, they're assimilating, but they're not affirmed anyway, or they feel like they're not good enough anyway. It can have a direct impact on a young person's self-esteem. So while I definitely believe it is a survival technique, and to some level, maybe even a skill set, because once again, you're switching between two languages. I believe it's important to tell youth, you need to show up as yourself, you know, and all of what that brings to the table. And, you know, that's my perspective on it. And I think they will feel more comfortable showing up as themselves when we allow Black and Brown adults to show up in spaces as themselves. So what we see in the media, a hairstyle is a problem, or your voice is an issue. That's problematic. That's when I feel like underlying issues have to be addressed, such as implicit biases groups may hold and things like that.
Yeah, when our white brothers and sisters don't understand us, a lot of times it's because we are veiled by these code switching situations, where we feel a lot of times we feel obligated to make a switch. I couldn't agree with you more. We need to show up as who we are so that they will know who we are and they can learn, you know, and we can all learn from each other. But there's so much more that our white brothers and sisters need to learn about us, because we've learned plenty about white society in this country. Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add a little bit to that. So when we're talking about switching between languages, in this very specific circumstance, we're talking about switching between American English and what literature currently calls African American Vernacular English, AAVE. In the 90s, we called it Ebonics. But those are kind of the switch, right? And so at a very young age, I could use myself as an example, Shandia. I'm going to speak on your behalf. I'm just going to say you too. We become very proficient. We become very proficient at being able to navigate these two languages. Now, there are scholars that debate whether AAVE is a language or a dialect, semantics. It certainly is. And I think that we would value the code switching more, or we would value AAVE more if we recognize it as a language. Because I've never heard in the educational system being multilingual as a negative thing. But in this circumstance, I think our Black and Brown children we're not viewing them, or some people are not viewing being able to navigate or have a whole separate language with its own grammatical context and script and lexicon as being a valuable contribution to society. It is. It is. We see it on commercials. The dominant society benefits from our culture's creativity. And a lot of that creativity is in our physical expression, but it is certainly in our language. And so my thought is allowing students, your kids, to express themselves in their home language is not a negative thing. It's most certainly not discriminatory.
I agree. I was thinking about the idea that, in Africa, you can be, let's just say you're from Zimbabwe, you could be speaking 6 or 7 different languages, and they call them languages, even though in many cases they may be dialects, and so when I think about African Americans, when I think about Black people, there have been so many circumstances that have caused us, or that I guess we may have just jumped right into it, somehow organically got into speaking in a way that sometimes our own people didn't understand us. I remember when the hip hop culture was coming through, and there was language that older people, let's just say, the R&B generation did not understand, that the hip hop generations was speaking. But it's not just the hip hop generation. There's so many other circumstances that have caused us to come up with language that we feel is necessary to be spoken. But I go back to something that Shandy was saying, and that, just really showing up as ourselves, really people understanding who we are, helping them to understand who we are. This is what you get. Now, let's take this journey together. It'll be a real journey. It'll be a transparent journey, and let's share with each other who we are. I think that's a very healthy way of going at it. I know that our time is coming to a close, but I know that there has to be some questions. I know I had a bunch of questions, but there's some questions that are in the chat that we want to go to. And Danielle, if you would share with us some of the questions that are there.
Yeah, so we actually only have one more question. So if you are comfortable with answering that, I feel like we're not too over time. This question is, if a child sees or hears a friend display a racist idea, how do we help them process and respond to the friend? Are there teachers trained to be an aid?
I would say you should reach out to the school counselor or school social worker. A school counselor or a school social worker would be better equipped to help the children process their feelings and help children with conflict resolution overall. I would say you want to reach out to whatever school that child attends and ask to speak to the counselor or the social worker. Student service staff are trained to help in those difficult conversations. And just, really talk to your child about what friendship is, what it means, the importance of who they hang around, and just getting back to the basic of friendship. And actually, one of the groups that I run, we talk about what is a friend, what is an acquaintance, what is a frenemy, what is an associate, defining those types of terms. I don't know how old or how young your child is, but starting with the basic definition so that they understand. Sometimes, if a person is toxic, you may have to move beyond that friendship, and that is okay. It is a healthy part of your child's development.
And I just want to say, in having that conversation with your child, let's say, for instance, your child and you decide, hey, maybe this isn't a friend that you want to have. That doesn't mean that they never are going to have communication, or they can't be friends with them later once that the other child kind of comes to a reckoning about, hey, what you're perpetuating is racism. They might not even know themselves. Before the age of 25, our prefrontal cortex, which is at the very front of the brain, is not developed. That means anyone under the age of 25. And the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that helps us regulate emotion. It helps us be rational and make rational decisions. And so that's not an excuse, but keep in mind that as your child grows through childhood, adolescence to young adulthood, they can change, and hopefully they will, to be a better citizen and community member, but people that they were connected to in their youth could be too. I also think that books are a good way to kind of introduce some of these concepts. And so these are just two that I have. We actually have a resource list, but one is a child's book about racism. You can see it's very thin. It's for very small children. It has very basic language and gives a very clear and basic definition about what racism is. This other one is by Ibram Kendi, which for those of you that are a part of book clubs may have heard, Stamped from the Beginning. He created a version of this. It's called Stamped. It's for teens. And then I believe he has another version for children as well. And so I think this one's for 12 and up. And the other version is for younger children. But again, this is a thicker book, but if you're intending to have this ongoing conversation, as we've kind of mentioned over time, this doesn't have to be heavy study material. It can be something that you and your child kind of read together over a period of time and process after each chapter. You know, what were your thoughts? What did you learn? What stood out to you, to integrate and get used to having those sorts of conversations.
Yes, and to Dr. Mitchell's point, that author of that book, I believe the University of Pittsburgh is having a conference, I believe in July, and we included this on our resource page, and I believe he is one of the keynote speakers. So if you want to learn more or get connected on a deeper level, you might want to register for that conference.
Could I share our resource list for a quick moment? I know that we're over time.
Yeah, of course, and we'll also send it out. But yeah, go ahead and share that. And also, if anybody has any other questions that they would like to ask, please submit them to myself at danielle.chakowski@centeroflife.net. I did put that in the chat. I don't expect any of you to remember that, but feel free to email me any of your questions.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of show you all for a quick moment some of the resources. I wanted to highlight this one over here. Our Miss Shandia Booker has a wonderful book called Dear Brooklyn, Love Yourself for our youth. But as someone that has read it and wrote the foreword, it actually is really helpful, even as an adult, for you to kind of reflect and think about friendships that you've developed and things in it, for those that are interested in a faith-based resource that also integrates biblical scripture in it. But there are books, TV shows, websites. Sesame Street came out with a workshop coming together that focuses on racism. We know that there is a racism town hall. We wanted to highlight Pitt has positive racial identity development in education program that you might want to look into, and they have a pretty comprehensive website. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. And this list was specifically for children and adolescents. So resources that you can use in with your child, but certainly this is not an extensive list. I actually have a longer list of resources if anyone is interested in kind of digging into some of this work as you're attempting to have these courageous conversations with your children and adolescents.
Yes. And if you're attempting to do some self-reflection, Harvard University has a implicit bias test you can do. It is just the beginning. We both agree, Dr. Mitchell and I, it's a good starting place, but it's not an ending place, but you might want to check that test out for yourself. We'll include that in the resources that we can provide to the center.
Yeah, we have it listed here. The project Implicit Association, I actually assign for my students to do it every semester. It doesn't mean, the result that you potentially would get does not mean that you are discriminatory against a particular population. It means that you may have an implicit bias. That means an unconscious association. You may prefer, they have one on weight, so you might prefer someone that is a little bit more thin than heavy, right? And so that makes sense because we're conditioned and socialized in a society that tells us that certain things are right and certain things that are wrong. But if you have an awareness about that implicit association, you can do the work to grapple with it. And so, yeah, there's just so many resources. We wanted to leave you all with something beyond beyond our few words. We also wanted to.
Dr. Mitchell, can I say one thing before we get to this slide? In talking about implicit biases, I think it's important. What we see now going on in our nation is the fruit of unaddressed implicit biases, unaddressed issues with discrimination. We see the fruit, right? And the sad part is people are dying, but we have to get to the root of the issue. So it's important that you do begin to do the work, because ultimately, if you begin to do the work, we can see the fruit of that. So that's everyone doing their part to get to a better outcome. And I think it's a good time for us to do the work and do it collectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Michelle Mitchell and Shandia Booker, it's not very often you get two experts to come on and speak that can answer your questions before you even ask them. And I just have to tell you, this has been a very rich experience listening to you all. And so much of what you've shared with us is so practical and things that we could actually practice on a daily basis. Thank you for preparing in the way you've done it. And thank you for sharing these things in ways that we could actually digest it and take it and use it and reuse it. I'm hoping that we can come back together again and that you all can share more. And I guess the next time you come back, it'll be Dr. Shandia Booker, huh?
Yes! Yes!
I hear that doctor. I hear that doctor.
Yes! Thank you so much, Tim. Yes.
Well, listen, it's you all are just outstanding work that you're doing. I'm just excited. I'm looking forward to reading your book as well. And I know that that the people who have joined us on this webinar have been richly rewarded by your participation here. And we want to thank everybody that has joined us tonight. We want to thank you for being a part of this very important discussion. I would encourage you to look at the different websites and the different links that we've placed up for the references that both Dr. Mitchell and Shandia have shared with us, so that you can benefit and begin to use those things. And of course, if you have any questions, please reach out to Danielle with your questions. I would like to close just by saying, some years ago, we know that we elected our first African-American president. And there were people who said that racism was over because we elected our first African-American president. Well, we know that racism was not over. As a matter of fact, it became even more visible and prevalent as time went on. But a seed was planted. And I think that's the thing that we have to look at. Even in this Derek Chauvin case, a seed has been planted. Justice has been served. Justice to a point has been served. George Floyd is gone. He will not be coming back. At some point, Derek Chauvin, if he lives, he will get out of jail. And so, when we talk about justice, we have to think about that relatively. But a seed has been planted even in this moment in time that we're in right now. And so that means that we have space to hope for more. And as I look at these two young women that have joined us here tonight, it gives me so much hope that we will be able to educate our society. We'll be able to educate all of our brothers and sisters that walk with us, whether they be brown, Black, white, Latino, all of our brothers and sisters will be better educated so we can live together and really recognize the humanity in all of us and the uniqueness in all of us as individuals. Thank you again for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you in our next webinar.
Thank you.